think that maybe we can start. I will just introduce myself. I know some of you, like Suvik and Hernani, already know me. I'm Joana. I'm from Interaction Design Foundation. And I've been leading the Lisbon Group for a few years now. We have started these talk sessions, even though this one is a bit different. We have this partnership. We did it for a few years now. Now we have OutSystems. So if you don't know Interaction Design Foundation, it's an online platform for UX courses and literature. Feel free to check it in. Even if you don't want to join Interaction Design Foundation, you can always join us in the Facebook groups. We have a group for Portugal, for Lisbon, for Coimbra, for Porto. And I know some of you are not from Portugal, but I'm sure you will have them in your own countries. Edith, which is our partner, is also a school that has headquarters in Lisbon and in Porto. They have a lot of design courses as well. And OutSystems is a low-code platform that has been also organizing these events with us. We will be having them from 2 to 2 weeks, always at 7 online. So feel free to register for the next ones. For today, we will have Alexa. And we will have this talk for around 40 minutes, I think, and then we will have a Q&A session where you can raise your hands. If you don't know how to do this, you can click in participants and just raise your hand there, and you can make direct questions to Alexa. But in the meanwhile, if you feel like she's talking about something you really want to make a question, you can do it in a chat and I will read to Alexa. So without no further ado, Alexa, thank you for coming.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me and for inviting me, Joe. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to talk about design, specifically UX design. So let me share my screen. Hopefully you can see this properly. Awesome. So I know some of you are going to come in and join and leave. It's totally fine. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. As Joe said, she might pick some of them as we go along and we can just incorporate them in the conversation. If not, we can talk about all of this at the end. And really what we're going to talk about today is scaling up UX practices, and most importantly, where to start. And even more importantly, when you're working with large and diverse teams. That's my area of expertise. So a bit more about me before we get into the full topic so that you know who you're talking to. I'm Alexa, not the robot, the real person, the original version, let's say. I'm from France, and I'm actually from this tiny village in the south of France, and you can see a photo of that on the right-hand side. That's actually at the end of my street, and I'm super proud to be from there. So if you're wondering what this weird accent is, it's not Portugal, it's actually France, but I've lived all over the place. I currently live in London. This is where I'm calling you from today. But I actually spent the last 4 years living in New Zealand. Literally at the other side of the world. And there I used to be the enterprise expert at Optimal Workshop. So if you haven't really heard of Optimal Workshop or you're not super familiar with it, first of all, Google them, they're great. But if you want the fast track version, essentially Optimal Workshop is a company that develops a user experience research tools. So it's a platform through which you can run lots of different types of quantitative surveys to get insight from your potential users. And it's really meant to help you test early and test often in the design lifecycle. That's what it's meant to do. There are a million ways to do research, and all research is good, but this one is specific. And so I spent the last 3.5 years working there, and I became essentially the expert at accompanying large global corporations integrate into their sort of like the scaling of their practice, incorporating new methodologies and sort of helping them change as they went. And so really my area of involvement with working with some of the biggest companies you can think of was really twofold. So I first intervene in we call it the discovery and evaluation phase. And that's essentially when companies are trying to figure out what they want and what they need. So it's like, even before they decided they want to work with you or not, they just are thinking, look, this is our problem. This is what we're going through. What do you think? And so there was a lot of consultative work with all sorts of companies in that phase. And then a bit later, once companies have decided what they wanted, or they sort of like had a clearer picture, we worked with them on implementation and adoption of these new methodologies, working with their team to sort of shape as they scaled and make sure that it was successful all along. So I went on this journey with over 100 different companies all across the world on all continents. And so that's really where I'm coming from today. I'm coming with this perspective of not having lived and breathed research within one company, but within 100, and across lots of different industries and lots of different stages of scaling. And so that's really where I want to share sort of my perspective and some advice on what I've learned and what I've sort of synthesized from doing that for quite a while. And we're really going to go through 4 major themes today. First of all, it's always important to set the scene. Why are people even considering scaling UX? And if you're joining this call today and you're thinking, is that even for me? When do people want to do this and why? We'll definitely be covering that. And then we'll go over some of the prep work. If you've decided that that's sort of something for you, we're going to go through some of the prep work that's actually really important to set yourself up for success once you start getting into the first steps. Obviously, there's no blueprint there's no one right way to scale your UX practice, but there are definitely some commonalities and some common steps that companies take that tend to make them more successful in the long term. And so I'm going to cover those in the third part. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about, cool, so once you've had the first steps, once you've launched into the first steps, what happens next? What are some of the key things that are quite important and can gear you towards being lean at adapting and keeping that momentum going? So those are the 4 themes that we're going to explore. So let's start with setting the scene. And why is this issue even on the radar today? Not just maybe for you personally, but in the industry overall. It's something that is happening, that people are talking about. It's verging on being a little bit of a buzzword. Why? So essentially, there's a bit of a pendulum momentum going around scaling, and frankly, scaling anything, but especially in UX. So there are things that are actually not new. Lots of companies going through major digital transformations and UX becoming more of a sort of established concept across different industries. Some companies obviously still struggle with evangelizing the importance of UX, but it's actually now quite widespread that we need to care about user experience. And what's also not new is that we have to do this while our teams are being increasingly distributed across geographies, across business units, across the world. And so that's something that actually has nothing to do with 2020. It's been coming for a while. But what's really accelerated recently is that every company has had to ask itself, how do we reinvent our services in a remote first world? How do we do that? And how do we pivot so that we can stay sort of active and functioning throughout this time? And that means changing a lot of work patterns for teams, especially in UX, that is a heavily collaborative field where I think if you work in UX or in research or design, you will know that the favorite thing for a designer, research or UXer to do is to go in a room with 10 other UXers and a bunch of post-it notes and a marker pen, and then that's like happy days. So you can't actually do that now, or there are digital ways, but you have to sort of reinvent how you get across, to those concepts. And frankly, just almost to a point of social responsibility, there's a need to create better human experiences now more than ever, because a lot of people are disconnected, because we can't work in the same way that we always have. It is becoming really a central piece of how companies move forward positively. So that sort of has prompted the acceleration of quite a few trends. First of all, everybody's favorite topic, team restructures. If you have worked at a company for over a year, I can guarantee that once, maybe twice, someone has talked about or gone through a restructure, either growing the team, shrinking it, reshuffling how you work. This is something that it's clearly like a misalignment between how could we be more effective. So that's something that's been accelerated. Also, how do we get user insights? You can't have a lab and invite people in and get their insights and watch them use prototypes. You have to figure out new ways of getting people's insights while still working at the same cadence. And that means that, honestly, business have been under increasing pressure for teams to change really, really quickly, while at the same time, revisiting budgets, investments, priorities, everything is being reassessed. So that sort of creates a catalyst for UX, in especially the UX practice, needing to change, needing to evolve, and needing to scale. So this is really where we're at today, and why so many different companies are asking themselves these questions. Essentially, they need to be doing more, faster, with potentially less resources. Also, there's a global pandemic happening. So that sort of leaves people in teams in charge of these topics, shuffling a million different things and trying to figure out, well, how do I even approach this? We don't have 6 months to figure it out. We sort of need to do this relatively soon. How do we approach it? What do we need to think about? So if you find yourself in this situation and you sort of hit that point where you need to keep being end user focused, and the way that you've done it until now is not really appropriate, you might be considering scaling your UX practice, or even whatever that means. If you were barely doing it, that's still scaling if you need to do sort of a little bit more of it. So this is really where you would start to think, okay, well, what do I do about it? How do I approach this? Who do I talk to? Like, how do we approach this topic? So my biggest advice out of everything I'm going to say tonight is, don't launch frankly into anything without doing prep work. And that is valid for frankly anything you do in your life. You wouldn't just launch into buying a house, launch into doing anything that's quite significant and it's going to change the way you operate every day. And that is especially true for UX practice, because it's kind of complex and there are lots of different parts. So my top advice, and what I've seen people who have done this quite successfully do, is before they get into anything, they try to figure out, why are they scaling and what are they trying to scale specifically? So let's explore both of these themes. First of all, why are they really need to pinpoint, why are people looking to scale? And look, I know that when you need to do something and you need to get something done, the last thing you want is to take 2 weeks to figure out why is the concept of all of this. It's like you sort of like need to get moving. But so what I'm suggesting here is not taking 3 weeks, 10 workshops, and like 3 company town halls to figure this out. I mean, if you have the time, do it, but it really actually only boils down to figuring out where are there inefficiencies currently, or where are there opportunities to do it better, and what are the drivers for this change. And so some of the main questions that some of the customers that I've been working with, some of the companies that I've been working with, tend to ask themselves along those lines are, what's the dynamic within your organization right now, and why are you scaling? And I'll give you a couple of examples. I had 2 customers that I was working with that were trying to scale. One of them, because they were doing so well with the pandemic, they were a purely online business. They were facilitating collaborations for teams. They were providing these types of services. They were doing so well that they're like, we need to hire 50 more people. We need to just significantly expand. Our market is going great. Okay, great. Then that's the dynamic in which you're at. You know that you're coming into this because you're hiring, 50 new people, and that's why you're looking to scale. At the exact same time, I had another company saying, our budgets are getting strapped. Everything is frozen. We still have increasing demands of being more user-centric, of wanting to do more UX, but we actually are going to be strapped for resources. So we need to figure out a way to scale this while being as efficient and lean as possible. Those are 2 very different situations, but the question is the same. Where are you coming from? What is the company dynamic? Secondly, what is the level of UX buy-in that you have? What kind of maturity is there in your organization when thinking or talking about UX? I mean, do you have a VP of something that's all about it and will vouch for pretty much any project that you have along those lines? Or are you still in the process of trying to make it a little bit more dynamic and in terms of how people think and the importance of UX? That's going to be really important. Just a minute. I'm sorry. The issues of working from home. Give me just 1 second.
Take your time, don't worry.
Okay, raise of hands or messages in chats. How many times has this happened to you since the start of the pandemic where you're doing something really important and someone comes to your house to deliver a parcel? Me, pretty much on a daily basis. I'm so sorry. But I'm sure you can all relate to me because this is just the world that we live in right now. So anyway, where was I?
Can I just ask you a question on the topic that you were just saying?
Sure.
Because I don't think many organizations know the UX maturity level they are actually in. Can you talk us a little bit about this as well?
Absolutely. And honestly, some people dedicate like entire careers to try to figure that equation out. So I'm not trying to get you guys to solve this instantly, but a good way to approach it is when you mention UX or when you mention user experience to someone outside of your team, someone outside of design, what is their reaction? Do they feel, oh yeah, I kind of understand what we're trying to do. I understand why it's important. I sort of even understand how we make things user-friendly, or people just don't really have a familiarity with that topic or even an interest. So you don't have to have a precise pinpoint of our UX maturity is this. You just sort of need to have a feeling for, is the whole company behind this? I mean, I've worked with companies that literally go to conferences and say, we are user obsessed. We care so much about user experience. This is at the front of everything that they do. And some very famous companies just go out there and say that. Is your company sort of like leaning towards that? Or is your company sort of saying, our user friendliness is about changing the colors on the websites or making the buttons a bit better? You can tell that there's a gap. And so that's sort of where we're getting at. Obviously, you can go more granular within your own UX practice, within your own team. You can try to see, okay, well, what is the difference of expertise between different people on their team? When I come to talks like this, does this resonate with me? Do I feel like I kind of know what they're talking about? Or is this like light years away from where we are as an organization? That's how you would approach it. You don't have to do a PhD about it, but you need to sort of gauge within your team and outside of your team, what's the response level, and sort of check yourself compared to others in the industry, I would say. Cool. And I think like the final point in this specific sort of approach and these types of questions is, what does the future look like? What kind of objectives are being put in front of you? You don't work in a silo. You're not in this vacuum of things that you would like to do. You work for an organization that has objectives and goals. So what is that? And how does that align with making things user-centric and making things design-centered? Who is going to back you if you are trying to scale, or are you going to find roadblocks more than anything? Figuring that out is quite important. And again, it's all about trying to be as lean as possible when you try to figure this out. If you have space and time and lots of people to come together and do that work and really think about those topics, awesome. But frankly, in the world that I've experienced, nobody has time for this. Nobody wants to spend time to do that work, but it's actually really important to pinpoint, because then you can track how you're trending over time. So just some things to think about. And then secondly, so once you figure out sort of like why, what are the drivers, what are the opportunities or the inefficiencies that you're facing now, you have to start thinking, well, what exactly within your UX practice are you looking to scale? And that's going to be super important because you can't do everything. There's nothing more confusing or frustrating for everybody than saying we should do more. No specificities, nothing concrete. Let's just do more of it. That actually is a way to have no focus at all. So really try to sort of narrow it down, and companies that have done that sort of like they are able to figure out their first steps much better. And a way to approach it is what is working and what's not working. What is the way to get the biggest win? What are the low-hanging fruits? So things like that may be, okay, well, think about research and your research practice within your UX design practice. How often do you do research? Who does it? How do you do it? All of these things. Is this something that you want to increase so that it's actually quite all right? Do you think that you could be more efficient by sort of approaching that topic first? Or are you focused a little bit more on culture? And I mean, culture is a very broad word, but in this specific context, what I'm talking about is the way that people think, talk, and conduct your UX at your company. So do you want to improve, sort of the way that your team approaches the practice, that the way, the different, the way that their workflow, for example, or how often UX is brought up when we talk about strategic initiatives, for example. Is that what you want to focus on when you talk about scaling it within your company? And finally, are you literally just talking about people, getting more people, changing the structure of the team, scaling the skills that your team has? All of these are actually really different areas of focus and will require completely different sort of initiatives to, bring to life. So try to pinpoint maybe an area or two that seems like is the most problematic for you, or one where you will get the biggest win if you focus a little bit on it. And an example of that, of a company that sort of like went through this journey and figured out that actually prep work was quite important, is a banking company that I was working with last year. And so they had heard, this big American, banking corporation, one of the biggest banks in the world, really sort of behind in terms of anything digital. And so they, sent all of their staff to lots of conferences, and they're like, everybody's talking about UX and scaling UX, and this is what we should do. And so they went out and started talking to lots of different vendors, which I was one of them, but we started talking with their team, and they're like, we want the enterprise support, we want everything, and talking a bit more about them. We're like, okay, so you want to invest in research, like this is the field that I was working in, so you want to invest in research, like why is that important to you, like why that specifically? And they were like, well, if we do more research, then we'll show that it's important to care about users, and then more people will think it's important to care about UX. And like this, we'll just spread the awareness of why it's important, and then we'll sort of fast track the digital transformation in a human-centered way. And so what we were actually getting down to the bottom of is what was driving them is their willingness to increase awareness. So we really work on culture, and it's almost as if they had heard the buzzword and they were like, we need to do something about this, but without actually understanding if there is a need for more research right now. What they were trying to do is try to generate more work so that there would be more awareness. And that's a completely different approach when you're looking to scale. You're looking to scale the awareness, the culture, the level of maturity. You're not actually trying to scale how much research you're doing. That's just a tool, and it might not even be the most appropriate tool, because what you're going to end up doing is spending lots of money on things that actually don't drive directly the level of awareness necessarily. So making sure that sort of sending them back to this original prep work, saying, okay, let's go back. what are you actually trying to do, and what is going to be the best use of your time? Because you don't have unlimited money and unlimited time. What you're really trying to do is get people to care about the work that you do and care about building things in a human-centered way. So let's focus on that. Like, let's focus on driving initiatives that do that rather than buying lots of tools. That's not necessarily the answer. And I don't know if that might resonate with something that either you've heard of other companies or something that you're going through a company where you're working, but buzzwords are incredibly powerful, you know, like people just want to get in on the action without actually taking a step back. So that's something to consider, you know, then the importance of that prep work. So let's say that you've done your prep work and you actually know like where this is coming from and why you're doing it and exactly what part you actually want to work on. There's a bit of a process that I've noticed across quite a few companies that we've worked with doing this to sort of get started positively. So I'm going to sort of outline there, and bear in mind that, again, there's no one way to do this. This is just a guide. I would love to hear your perspective on these different steps, but this is really just a synthesis of things that I've seen work extremely well in a specific order. So before we even get into that, I really want to start and talk about what not to do. If there is one thing to avoid, absolutely, it's kind of like a legacy, sort of like a nice follow-up on the story that I just talked about this giant banking company, where not to start is just literally just throwing money at the project, just whatever it is, just being like, here's $100,000, spend it out, and do that. That's going to be more confusing than anything. And when people come at me wanting to spend lots of money, this is exactly the face that I make. I'm like, no, this is not the way to start. And definitely just going on a shopping spree is not going to help you. You're actually going to bring more elements in and more resources in, and you're not going to know what to do. So that's where not to start. If you do have lots of money though, that's great, but like hold on to it. Don't just start there first. What you may want to do, and what I've seen a lot of companies do really successfully to start, is doing an audit of your practice. And so that's, you could spend a whole year doing that. It's some people's full-time job to do that, or you can also do it quite lean. I advise you, especially if you're starting this, do it in quite a lean way. But here are different themes that you want to sort of cover while you're looking at your UX practice. What are some of the tools, your tooling, people and skills, and process and culture? So let's talk about tools. I mean, you're gonna be working in a space where you do have tools. You have invested in things until now. So really understanding what do you have, how much are you paying for all of this, who's actually using it, and what are they using it for, and on what part of which projects. That's gonna be like really important, so that you can get a better sense of, is it worth it? Like the money that you're spending on that, are you actually not giving the proper tools based on what your team needs, and they end up doing lots of manual work that you didn't even know, and they just sort of do it because they think getting tools is hard. So I'm just going to do that work like that. Figure that out. And then one thing that actually is not talked about a lot, but because I used to work at a UX vendor, I know this for sure. Try to get a feel for what are your vendor relationships, because sometimes companies can, as a team, you can rely on your vendors for so much training, so much input, so much materials, like way more than just access to a tool. And a lot of companies don't make the most of that. And so try to understand who are the vendors that actually care that you're doing well, and that they want to help you and support you and give you lots of stuff for free most of the time. Figure that out. Try to find who are your allies outside of your organization that can help support this work at zero extra cost. And I would say that's quite helpful when you're thinking about tooling. Secondly, think about obviously people and skills. That's the core of your UX practice. Without people and their skills, there's nothing. So that's definitely an area to focus on. And getting a really good feel for what your team structure is. For example, is your team operating kind of as an internal agency? So when someone wants to engage in UX, they come to you and you sort of assess the project and you do it? Or do you have a team that's fully embedded in the product teams and they're there working with them every day and they're on every project and their insight is always a part of that? Those are two very different dynamics, and the needs of these will be different, and scaling those will be different too. Have a think about, what do you think, your team's, people on your team's career plans are? And I say that because one thing, a trend that I see a lot is people are trying to get designers to do a lot more research, a lot more, business presentations. Like they're really trying to get designers a seat at the table, which is awesome and is totally valid. That being said, that's not necessarily the focus of individual designers on your team. Maybe that's not what they want to do. So before you start scaling everything up and reshaping everything, figure out if, what people that you currently employ want to do, because all these changes might alienate them. They might, you might have a high attrition rate of staff if you change too much without actually having asked them what they think they want to get out of working there and how they think this is going to work out. So I would say that's something that's often quite overlooked. People just assume that staff will just go along with it. And I'm not saying ignore your company's objectives and priorities and just care about what individual people here do, but there's definitely, there's definitely a blend that needs to be done here, especially if you want to scale quite smoothly. And finally, processes and culture. We've talked about culture a little bit until now, but I think that, trying to map out how UX happens at your company. Is there a process in place? Who owns it? Who is tracking that? How are people aware of how, your company improves the user experience across the board? Is there actually something organized? Does it just happen and we don't really know how it happens? Or do people outside of your team not really sure how that happens? Again, you need to figure that out so that you get the full picture. And most importantly, you get all the data, because in data we trust. As we all know, you can't improve what you can't measure. So again, you don't have to spend 6 months doing this, but getting a feel for some of these points will help you figure out what to do next and what lever to pull next based on, the intention that you've set at the start. So what you want to do after that is figure out where the gaps are. So we were working I have a bit of an example here, what I mean by the gaps. And that's essentially where you are versus where you thought you were, or where you want to be. And so I was working with a really big company that does sort of like digital marketing solutions, like a global company, and they offer a platform where you could do digital marketing things. And so they came to us again saying, we have a big problem. We want to focus on, we want to scale. And in our scaling, we really want to focus on scaling research, because we just get overwhelmed and we have our stuff is overwhelmed. People always come to us and, we don't have enough tools. We don't have enough staff doing research. So we really want to focus on that. And this is really where we want to start. And so we started talking to them and trying to understand a little bit, well, why are people overwhelmed? Like, why do you get so many inquiries? What's happening? And actually, doing this work with them, they ended up realizing that they said, well, people come to us and say, have you got research on X? What kind of research do we have on this topic? I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but that's kind of a common ask in companies. They're just like, research, what do we have on this topic? And the team was like, I don't really know. We're not working on this right now. I'm not really sure, but I can put something together. So they were always trying to scramble to do bits of research when people just like happen to need something. But what they didn't have is an efficient system to actually track and organize all the research that they had been doing historically, so that when someone says, do we have research on X? It's really easy to go into that space and say, well, yeah, 3 years ago we did something on this topic. There you go. You can download it. There you go. Off you go. Here's the research on that. They felt like every time they had to do new research because they couldn't find or they didn't have access to stuff that was done before, it was isolated in lots of different areas of the business. People worked in a really siloed way. And so what they ended up figuring out is actually what they need is not, the gap is not, let's do more research. The gap is, we're doing a lot of research, but we're not keeping track of it. Everybody's keeping this in their own little siloed team. What we actually need is a centralized place to store all the research, to organize it so that if anybody in the business wants to know anything that's been researched on, they can just log into the space and find it themselves. They're not bogging us down, and we don't have to feel like we have to do last minute research all the time on stuff that is not our strategic priority right now. And so that's a major reassessment of a real problem that you're having, but actually comparing that to, is there any, efficiency? Is there anything else that is actually preventing you from looking at this the right way and figuring out, what the appropriate step would be? And yeah, that was interestingly enough, that's actually a problem that I don't know if you guys are going through this, but that's actually one of the major problems that I see across the board, is that people actually do a lot of great work, but they don't centralize it in a place that's accessible to other people. And so they find themselves sort of reassessing that. I'd be really keen to hear your experiences or thoughts on that, because I feel like everybody's trying to figure it out, but no one has found a really efficient way. So anyway, love to hear your thoughts on that. But essentially, once you've sort of figured out where the gaps are between your reality and sort of where you think you could be more efficient, you have to start thinking long-term and not just, okay, well, we're going to start something and we've really narrowed down the issue that we have, but where do we want to take it? Scaling is not something that you do for a couple of months and then you leave it. It's a vision. It's a long-term initiative. So, where do you take it? And essentially, now that you have all your data points, it must feel like this kind of genius in a room where it's where could we go? But that's going to be really the step that is where you align the reality of your practice and the reality of your understanding of how UX can be done and your company's objective. And that's going to be really personal and really different depending on the organizations. So I'm going to talk about a few different examples of companies that all want to scale, but what that scaling is and the vision for that is completely different depending on who they are. So for example, we were working with a company in B2B tech, and they decided that, based on where they were at and how they wanted to scale, they decided that their ultimate vision for scaled UX practice is for every single business unit to be completely independent. So almost every product team would be a separate business, and they would have their own everything, and they would just be able to determine what works best for them, because, centralizing everything didn't work. So that's what they think ultimately success looks like that. For another company in the healthcare system, they decided, well, our focus is we want to put a metric in that not a single project goes out without research, because they felt that their gap was that, they didn't do that efficiently. For an education-centric company, they said, well, we don't want to have specialists. We want everybody to be multitasking across the UX practice spectrum. And so we want to focus on cross-skilling and upskilling everybody. And we want to have everybody to be a bit like a Swiss Army knife within all of our teams so that we can be leaner. For a giant social media company, they decided that scaling, the ultimate success of scaling for them would be to create an ecosystem where there are no roadblocks for their teams, and they want to hire excellent people, and they just want to create an environment where they can choose to do whatever they want, because they hire brilliant people and they just want to give them all the tools and not bog them down with processes and red tape and any of that. They just want them to be free and be excellent in the spirit of the company. With another financial services company, they went the complete opposite way. They were like, we want to ensure quality standards, and we want to make sure that the way that we do UX and we practice UX here is can be reproduced really easily as we scale up. So we want to streamline everything, put really specific standardized processing in place to make sure that this is like a culture that is repeatable across teams, and that everybody approaches it the same way. So we put more sort of guardrails and focus on processes, which is completely opposite from the social media company. And finally, with one of the big e-commerce companies that I was working with, they were saying, we just want to be leaner. And that means be able to be more agile and to test often and test early and just really innovate earlier on, not later down the design life cycle when we've sort of spent 6 months on this and we don't really want to change it now, no matter what the feedback from users are. We already spent a lot of time on this. Let's just go with it, or tweak a couple of things and go. We want to be much leaner, much agile earlier on. That's what scaling looks like for us. So as you can see, 6 companies, completely different outlooks, but it's all scaling. And that's what I mean. At the end of the day, it's like, what aligns with your company culture? What, based on where you're at today and who's driving this, what does success look like? That's important to figure out. And so once you've sort of have that pinned down, again, you can always course correct later, but we're talking about getting a starting sort of step, right? So having some form of vision to start is important, because after that, you're going to have to prioritize on, how you bring things into the fold. And I really want to emphasize on bringing things into the fold, not just uprooting everything and, just changing everything. I've seen companies do that. And I've worked with companies who literally from one day to the next were like, we fired half of the team. We don't want to do this anymore. We just fired everybody and we're going to do this now. And that change is brutal. And these companies have to work so much harder at course correcting and sort of bringing everybody along later than if they had tried to bring these changes into the fold. And it's the same with most things that you do in life, but specifically with this, because it is quite modular and it's, it involves lots of different moving parts. So after you figure out your vision, you're gonna have a priorities problem because there's so many things to do and you're not really sure how to approach it. But at the end of the day, you still have to narrow it down on some initiatives. So I'll take back the examples that I have just given across these 6 companies and give you a bit of a feel for what some of these steps might look like for companies that are going through this and decided on these very different visions. For the B2B tech company, that was trying, you guys might remember, like they were trying to establish like every business unit is their own little siloed company. They were like, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to give everybody their own budget and we're going to strip down the procurement process. So we're not going to make it really hard for them to get new tools, get consultants, get new staff. We're going to strip it all down and we're really going to delegate leadership. So we're going to trust people at the most, I don't want to say lowest, but at the sort of like the most local level, if you wish, to do their job. But then obviously we're going to depend on these leaders to sort of report back up and see how everything is going. But that's the first thing that we're going to do. We're going to strip everything down and give people their independence back. For the healthcare company that was trying to get research into absolutely everything, they decided that the first thing that they were going to do is to make it absolutely mandatory to have either a research plan or a researcher attached to a project for it to get approved. So they made this one barrier. And again, you can, when you take these different approaches, you might still have people who try to work around it, include someone not actually doing it in good faith, but it actually breeds a type of behavior and a type of care. So they decided that they were going to trial that and see how that went. And it actually worked out really well for them. In the education company that where I mentioned that they wanted to cross-skill and focus on cross-skilling and upskilling, that's the one that I was mentioning. They got rid of half of their team, and the other half, they redirected this funded to knowledge sharing and really training everybody that was there and their design team. So there was quite a shift, and it's a gamble. Honestly, this one was like, it was pretty rough, but this company had such a great company culture that people sort of went along with it. But that was one that was probably one of the most extreme that I've seen. Social media giant that wanted to focus on creating this great, ecosystem for UX. What they did is that they actually took a step back and said, we want people to be independent, but we want the overall structure and environment to be great. So we need to hire lots of people in operational roles to craft this ecosystem. And we're going to really focus on data and metrics to make sure that, because we're letting people be completely free in this ecosystem of like great UX, pretty much access to everything, we sort of want to take a step back, but still track what everybody's doing to sort of analyze trends. So a quite interesting approach. The company in the financial services that wanted to create more structure and more rigorous processes, that's exactly what they did. They really focused on specifically defining workflows and processes and put a repository and structure in place so that people had to follow certain steps and then upload everything that they were doing in a centralized space. So again, the absolute opposite of the social media giant. And finally, the e-commerce company that was trying to be leaner, they increased their research initiatives and investing and training into lo-fi prototyping and working in sprints. So make sure that they were much more agile and including that. So working in 2-week sprints. And that was really a massive sort of mindset change for them, but that was actually quite good because it was a narrow focus, but more of a pace change. So again, your priorities can look lots of different ways, and here are lots of different examples of things that you might want to explore depending on where you're at. But at the end of the day, all of this leads to scaling. So there's no one way to scale. There's just a process to follow if you're trying to scale in your own individual way as a company. So and then the final step is, the final step to everything. Once you've sort of set the motion in place, try to evolve progressively and organically if you can. Now, I mean, you guys might roll your eyes here because has anyone ever worked at a company where you've been given all the time and space in the world to progressively grow with no pressure whatsoever? Like, no, let's be honest, this never happens. Ideally, it would be great, but most of the time you have someone being like, what's going on? Where is the scaling? It's just really intense. So at the end of the day, we all know that ideally you have this space and people give you a bit of space and time to make it happen. Most of the time you won't have it. So if you don't have it, try to focus on these 2 M's: managing expectations and metrics tracking. Managing expectations means that you know that this is going to happen. You know that you're going to get pressured. So manage everybody's expectations, your team's expectations, knowing that, look, we're trying to set that in place and it's going to be wonky, but we're still going to have to pump out work. So let's try to make it work. But at the same time, manage up. So manage whoever is your sponsor, whoever are the other stakeholders that are working with you and really sponsoring these initiatives. Make sure that they understand that change doesn't happen overnight. And through metrics tracking and making sure that you understand back to the audit where you started and how all of these different steps are building up to you actually improving, making gains, you're going to be able to buy yourself a lot of time. But you can't do that without tracking things efficiently. So again, you're not a marketing website, so you're not going to be able to have trackers on everything, but try to keep an eye and keep tabs on the different initiatives that you're running. And so that's it. That's sort of the different steps. I'd love to hear your perspective at the end, as if this sounds like something that, looks like something that you've been through, or were there additional things that if you went through this process or you're thinking about this process, you think actually that something's really missing in here. But that's, through my experience working with all these different companies, really the commonalities in these processes. I will give you one hot tip though. The one thing that made the biggest difference between companies that did sort of like, all right, yeah, they're scaling, they're doing okay, it's like ups and downs, but it's like going well, and companies that did amazingly, really those that, I've worked with some of these companies for 2 or 3 years. So we had time to like check how things are going, and some that saw the most consolidated change, the fastest, the most efficient, and that actually was sticky, are companies that invested in operations. And what I'm talking about here is design operations and research operations roles. So what are those? If you're not familiar with those are essentially full-time jobs or part-time jobs that is only dedicated to managing your UX practice. It can be more granular if you're just focusing on design or just focusing on research, but essentially it's someone's job to make sure that they keep an eye on all of this, that they do that work. It's their job to make sure that they think about all of these things, they talk to all the vendors, they care about where their team is at emotionally in their work, they care about making sure that all the stakeholders are informed, that they're managing expectations, that they're setting this up. And that's a massive, let's not kid ourselves, that's a massive luxury. If your organization can do that and do that and have money to employ not one person, but maybe even a team of people to do that, that's huge. And you're really gonna make huge strides. A lot of the time, if you're working for either a smaller company or a company that doesn't have a huge UX maturity, what's going to end up happening is that it's someone who is a designer, who is a design leader, a researcher, who is going to be doing this job on top of their existing job. So it's going to seem like, okay, someone is going to take this on. Usually it's someone that's already in a leadership position. And what I really mean to say here is that this is work that is going to happen no matter what. If you're scaling, whether you hire a team or whether you do it on top, or you or someone on your team is doing it on top of their work, the most important thing is to make sure that it doesn't go unnoticed. If you're doing this on top of your own job, or you know that someone in your organization is sort of like taking this on, bringing awareness to it and really highlighting the fact that scaling doesn't happen without someone like that, without people dedicated to make sure that this process is done well and thinking strategically around this. And so even if you can't have like a dedicated person, make sure that you bring awareness to those tasks that are being either done or delegated between different people, so that it gets brought into the fold of this is something important. Someone needs to think about these things. And if we're designing all day, we don't have time to do that. There needs to be extra support in just thinking about that changing structure. And yeah, there's some great events and talks and resources out there on what these sort of roles and practices look like. It's a relatively, new field. I'd say maybe it's really started booming in the last maybe year or two or so. Like a couple of years ago, I went to a design ops conference in New York, and most people who were there, who were in these roles, had been in there less than a year. And that's like one of the biggest conferences on design ops. So you could tell it's like really new, but I think bringing more awareness to it is definitely going to help. So that's my hot tip. So before we wrap up, now that we've sort of like launched things, and we've set our steps up, and hopefully we're bringing awareness to the sheer amount of work that is needed to just even make this happen. Let's talk about how do you keep that momentum going once you've launched it? Because at the end of the day, it's not going to be you launch it once and you see it thrive and it's never going to change and it's just going to go up and up and up and it's going to be great. No, you're going to have to course correct. Halfway through, things are going to change and you're going to have to pivot. So what are some of the things to keep in mind to make sure that you're keeping that health and keeping that momentum as you're scaling, especially in the early stages? There are a million things that could be said on that, and there are lots of great resources online, so I encourage you to go look for them. But I sort of narrowed it down to the 3 ones that I saw through my experience were probably some of the key ones, but happy to discuss that again. First of all, like anything in life, be clear. That is the key to bringing people along with you. If you're going to go through all these changes and you decide that you're setting a strategy for scaling all of this, but you actually don't tell anybody the specifics of what's entailed and what are the different steps that you're thinking about, not just your own UX team that's going to change, but also all the stakeholders that work with you, and even your company as a whole, if you're trying to spread awareness, for example, or if you're sort of evangelizing around UX. setting clear expectations is going to be the key, because again, there's nothing worse than someone saying, we're going to scale. Lots of things are going to change. We're starting with this one thing and then we'll see. It's like people get nervous and either they get nervous or some people will just reject change. You know, an objection that we used to hear all the time when in companies that weren't being transparent and clear about this process was, this is just another fad. This is just another thing that they're trying to be cool. They're trying to be, you know, all modern, but they're probably not going to follow through. If you don't communicate that you actually have a strategy about this and that you're actively thinking about these things, people are just sort of going to reject, and it's going to be harder to bring them along. Secondly, set guardrails. And what I mean by guardrails is set a structure to make it safe for people as you move along. And that really supports the clarity initiative. Some people are just going to embrace everything that you put in front of them. They're going to be like, great, that sounds awesome. I've been really interested in that in the first place anyway. I'm thinking, you know, for example, if I saw that when you had people who had to upskill and cross-skill a lot. Some people just like, yeah, just drink it all in and like go for it. Other people are like not too sure. So making sure that you invest as much time as you can building resources so that people can always go back and refer to them and understand, okay, what am I supposed to do again? Everything is changing. Some people, again, might not use them, but those who will, that's going to be a lifesaver, and it ensures that you're really bringing everybody along. And thirdly, diversify the way that you communicate around this. That's important, especially in these times, because everybody's attention span is super short. We're all overwhelmed. Most of the time you'll have people working from home. They're dealing with like a million other things. They might have their kids at home. They might have other issues. They might be really worried. They might have been in lockdown for like 2 months and they're losing their mind. Whatever it is, people are overwhelmed. It's already a big change. If you don't make the communication around what you're trying to do accessible in lots of different ways, you're going to risk people not engaging. And that we saw that when we were working with an awesome company who provided financial services, and essentially they were trying to train their entire team on lots of different new topics of things they should adopt, etc. And so they came to us and say, hey, you know, we're not too sure what kind of training would be great, but you can chat with our team and see what they think. And so we went in and spoke with lots of different end users on their team, designers, researchers, all sorts of people, stakeholders, and just asked them a question. How do you like to engage with content? Do you like to go on a 1-hour call and figure it out? Do you like to have an article that tells you? Do you like to download things on your own pace? Do you want to watch a video later? Like, what is it? What overwhelms you and what do you like? And that was incredible, because we realized that so many people had different approaches to that. And if we didn't cater to at least some different needs, then we were gonna be leaving some people behind, and that's not gonna support the scaling. So I'd be really, again, keen to hear what some of you have done to work on that, low attention span, sort of like work overdrive and still trying to feed new information to your teams in terms of like changing processes. I'm super passionate about that, so I'd love to hear it. But at the end of the day, all I can say is good luck and Godspeed. It's not an easy shift, but it's one that increasingly, as I said at the start, we find ourselves in these situations, and there's sort of like no other way. You just have to grow in whether it's grow literally in terms of numbers or grow in terms of how much you're doing with the little that you have. It's a complicated task, and we're all doing our best, but hopefully the different steps that we explored today and the different stories that I shared either resonated with you, inspired you to try something new, or outraged you and you absolutely want to discuss this with me right now, which I'm super open to do. Maybe not the outrage part, but definitely the conversation part. That's it. So I have a couple of questions that I'm interested in asking you. I've asked quite a few questions along this sort of like chat, but so I'm keen to hear your questions, but if you're not too sure what what you want to ask or what you have in mind. Here's what I'd like to know. If you're starting this out or you're thinking about it, who do you see being your biggest allies outside of your team that will help you go through this process? Because that's a tricky one and there's no straight answer to that. So I'm kind of keen to hear some of that. If you'd like to share. And if this is something that you are going through or have already gone through, whoa, I totally missed a word in that sentence. Sorry, I wanted to say what has been the most positive surprise in your scaling journey? Apologies. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. But yeah, though there's some of the things that I'm asking myself. I'd love to hear what questions you have though. So maybe we can take some questions. Joe? Oh, you're muted? Sorry.
Still.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, sorry. Guys, do you want to make any questions? Please don't be shy. We are just a few of us, so I think we can open a conversation on this. In my end, I think I'm kind of lucky in the company that I work for. I think we have a good UX maturity level, and all the processes that we change. And of course, as in any company, processes are always changing, right? But I think you spoke on one thing that I think is very important, is to keep people informed and aligned, and to set the expectations. And of course, we all feel pressure, but we also know that things will take time for us to achieve what we want to achieve. And in that sense, I think I'm pretty lucky because we have people in charge of all these processes, and we review and we discuss and we brainstorm about it. So that's a great thing. I don't know if other people here have the same kind of environment at work or not.
When I actually don't know if, no, I don't see anything in the chat, but one thing that I've seen where people were being, just didn't have that support and still needed to align and still do all of these things, is that it's heavy work. Like, honestly, it's kind of heavy work. And the people that did it quite successfully are people that felt that this is something that it's an opportunity for leadership. And so again, that's not going to come naturally to a lot of people, but the members of these teams that saw a future at this company, that they thought, you know what, this is an opportunity for me to step up and actually do something that is going to impact all of us. And unfortunately for them at the start, it's kind of work that is unseen. And that's why I said earlier in the presentation, if this is something that you're going to take on just on your own, and no one really asked you to do this, but someone needs to do it, and you feel like this is going to benefit the process, highlight that. Talk about it. Talk about how this is work that you're doing. This is work that is important. Be an advocate for yourself and make sure that doesn't go unseen. And again, it's always, you're never completely alone, because a lot of people benefit from this information being clear, being accessible. So empower people to give feedback on that, and make sure that these loops exist, so that you can just hopefully take it further and really build that up for yourself. A lot of, I mentioned I went to a couple of conferences over the past 2 or 3 years. People who went up and said, I'm a team of one, and I've been doing this and at this giant company, I'm on my own, and these are my struggles, but this is what I've learned. And it's the same people that would come the next year and said, I'm excited because now it's 3 of us and we're doing this. And so anything, it's like almost self-promotion, but in a way that is, it's not just self-gratifying, because you're not just doing this to be in the spotlight. You're just trying to bring the right amount of recognition to work that is essential for major complicated processes to happen. And I think that's a fair way to talk about your work and highlighting the importance of that, for sure.
It's true. You spoke of another point that I thought it was very interesting, which was to centralize research, because I think this must be a struggle in most of the companies. And you asked about tools, and I saw that nobody replied to that in the chat. But I really would like to know people's thought about this. If a place like, for example, Confluence works for people. Because you can actually get things pretty organized. I'm a fan of Confluence, I must confess. But I don't know, guys. Like, what do you use nowadays? Can you give us some feedback? I think everybody's very shy or very starved. It's dinner time.
Well, in case you're just sitting back and listening because you actually don't know, I've come across quite a few different setups. Like I've seen everything from people using Google Drive, literally Google Drive, and just like creating tons of folders. But at scale, that becomes really unmanageable. Like that works for smaller teams, but it becomes really unmanageable. I've seen people, use Confluence, any versions of like intranets. Tend to be popular options because those are structures that already exist. They don't have to go out and test new products or tools. They're just like, this, we already have this, we already use this, lots of stuff, let's just build it in there, because these tools are becoming super efficient and they pump out new features all the time that make it really easy for you to pretty much use it for whatever. So those are really popular. And then the next sort of level of, no, there are two other levels after that. It's like people who buy literally dedicated tools. So tools like a popular one is Dovetail. You can also do research within that, but they're sort of positioning themselves as like a repository. People use, another one is Handrail. There are like a few of them that are sort of like coming up and that are getting increasingly popular. But obviously you're dependent on that vendor, but maybe that's fine. If you don't want to use an external vendor, what I've seen some really, really, really wealthy companies do is build their own. So they literally will just like go out and hire a team and build their own thing. There's a really popular case study on that I think it's like Thomas Sharon did that at WeWork, the company WeWork. He literally went out and like built their own repository and built that out and did, I don't know if he wrote a book about it, but he definitely wrote a ton of articles about it. And it's sort of like a famous case study on that. But obviously not everybody can afford to do that. So, there are lots of different ways, but I think starting off in whatever feels comfortable, like for example, Confluence or even Google Drive, starting out in that gives you a sense for what a good structure might be like, and how does that structure evolve with lots of different levels of complexity, for example, that happen over time, and then after you can decide if you want to spend $500,000 on a fancy solution that is like tailored to you, or if actually it works fine like that. I always say don't that's like my main thing. Don't go out and spend money before you know what you want and how that might work and how you've been trying to manage over time. And then if you really need it, then go out and buy something.
Sure.
Cool.
Alexa. Guys, do you really don't want to make any questions or to share thoughts?
Yeah, Joe, this is Sovik.
Hello, Suvik.
Yeah. Ideally, I do agree with Alexa regarding that. It is the duty of the management team or the leadership team to step up and to take the leadership to introduce this kind of process, and at least at the beginning stage. And while doing those kind of things, I was facing a bit difficulty while designing or developing the UX for some financial organization. They were looking for some ADA compliances, and while designing for those ADA compliances, we are facing that how we can achieve the goal for the disabled person, to how we can improve the UI and the UX for the disabled person, because most of the companies or most of the peoples understand UI UX means lot of JavaScript, lot of funky animations,
Yeah.
Yeah, either drop down or toggle or chain chain select box and those kind of things. But and at the same time, I do understand that those are really required to achieve certain goals. But I was facing some difficulties and I was really struggling to find out the solution, that how we can achieve those things as far as UI UX concerned for the disabled person, those who are having glaucoma, who are not, who are just listening the screen readers, and they are following those things, because those applications are for banking applications, and for the banking application, we have to think about the most as many people we can reach to,
Yeah.
so the more target audience we will be able to achieve, that will be more successful. So my question is that how we can implement process, because I was really unable to make our designer understand that okay, the UI UX is not about that design, that JavaScript thing or funky drop down and all those stuffs or animations and everything. We have to think about that, the right thing at the right place, so that it will be less intuitive.
That's a really good question, and I think the topic of accessibility. So that's what you're talking about, right? Like how do we make sure that we fold accessibility into our practice, and that it's unfortunately very much like what you're describing. Accessibility is very often an afterthought. It's like we built this thing, it's great. Oh yeah, how do blind people access it, or visually impaired people, or whatever. It's a major.
Not only for the visual impaired person, that suppose I am using any browser where JavaScript is disabled.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's across the board. Accessibility is really, it's not even just about can people, it's about can people literally access this no matter where they're coming from. And I was recently, through COVID actually, we were working with one of the healthcare departments, government departments in Europe, and what the challenge that they had is very similar. We're saying we need to get this information out to the general public. That means every single person in the country needs to be able to understand how to what to do if they have COVID symptoms. Like we need to put this information out, and people can't just walk up to their GP and ask them questions. Everything is closed. So how do we make this information through these applications absolutely accessible, no matter what phone you have, internet connection you have, like disability or not? And I think that to your earlier point of making sure that this is really coming from leadership is really crucial, because this is almost something that is too big for individual designers to decide if they care about it or not, or if it's within their team's process or not. This is something that either a company does as a whole or they don't do it. And when they don't do it, it's not the designer's fault. It's that the company didn't set it as a strategic initiative, because it requires so much adapting and so much change and testing and developing in so many different innovative ways that you can't just decide that you as a team just on your own are going to focus on this. It's not going to work out. It needs to, that's the kind of thing that really needs to come from the top down. There are some people, especially because of the pandemic, government departments have been really forced to make sure that they ensure those standards across every single thing that they put out there, and even extend that to their partners, their research partners, design partners. Like, for example, for the company that I used to work for, it was a major demand saying, well, if you guys supply us products that are not fully accessible, then we might not be able to work with you. And I think that's kind of like, it's a tough thing to do, but eventually that's what gets change. That's what makes change happen. Especially when it's a topic that really is about just bringing humanity back into what we build, so that whoever you are, you can have access to that. That's just, it's almost like the most basic level of social mission that you could ask for. And that being an afterthought doesn't really reflect well on either you as an organization or a government. So definitely a top-down situation, but I feel what you're saying. It's definitely something that a lot of us are experiencing. And thanks for that question.
Just regarding
thank you very much.
Suvik, we will have actually a talk on accessibility on January. So I will let you know the day after this. But this is a very interesting topic. And I think people misunderstand what means accessibility, as Alexa said. Like, we can, from a moment now, we can be momentarily impaired on some things, right? If I broke my arm, I'm impaired. So I will need to use some assistive technology. It's not, I don't need to be blind or anything to actually need the code to be accessible and the website to be accessible. And unfortunately, I think only governmental institutions must comply with at least AA standards.
Yeah.
But as Alexa said, and very well, in this moment, in this pandemic, that is becoming like a requirement that's across almost all industries. And I agree that it's very difficult to create a process and say, now, from now on, this is one of the things that we do, no matter if our client wants this or not. This is the way we operate. And I agree with Alexa when she says, like, yeah, this has to be like top management deciding from now on, we do this. We are compliant to this. Because otherwise you need accessible code, but you need accessible UI, you have this kind of designers that kind of like Apple, and I don't mean to offend Apple, like this beautiful gray, but has no contrast. And I have a bad display, and I'm unable to read what's written in there, So accessibility has to do with many things, and we need to inform our designers about these things and our developers. But definitely, that's a decision that I believe it must come from management. Of course, designers can push and say, no, like, we should be doing this because we have a voice, and I think we should fight for the things that we believe that actually can bring a better user experience to the user. But then ultimately, it should be a company goal.
Yeah.
This is a bit my take on this.
Yeah, it's very, very much along the lines of, what are your company ethics? And, with all the different social movements that we've seen this year as well, alongside the pandemic, we've had a lot of companies pop up and say, we believe in diversity, we believe in equality, la, 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 la. Okay, well, what are you doing? Are you just saying that, or are you actually doing something about it? And I think it's those companies that are taking those steps and saying, we're not just saying that because it's good to say, it feels good to say that right now. We would look bad if we didn't say that. It's like, is this a performance that you're saying we care, or are you actually changing and implementing change within your teams to support these different initiatives and the ethics that you say you care about? And I'm an optimist, so I think that a lot of companies are trying to do something about it, but ultimately what changes that on the list of priority is, are they pressured into it? Is a competitor doing that and they're not doing it? It's not that they never cared and they try and do it. It's like it's just in terms of priority ranking, unfortunately, but it's still in there. And I think we're definitely gearing towards like a more inclusive world. At least I believe, I want to believe that, I want to work for that. And I think that companies are making strides, and just the fact that the UX industry exists is proof of that. So
very true.
Thank you very much for your explanation. Yes, I do agree with you, and yeah, I also agree that it should be a top-down approach. And that's the thing that I tried to discuss with you, and wanted to know your standpoint, so that just to validate whether I am in a right track or not, because I am trying to impose those things and I'm trying to take the leadership of that goal, and I'm just working on that thing in our organization. So that is why I'm trying to revalidate my perspective and my thought process with you.
That's great. Well, good luck to you. It's a hard fight, but it's a worthy one. And I think the more public you are at speaking about these things, the easier you're making it for yourself, because no one is going to publicly disagree that this is not a priority. No one is going to stand up against you and say, no, we shouldn't do this. We shouldn't care about this. Everybody is going to agree. So the more public you are, the more open you are, the bigger the platform you get, the more people are going to follow you, because it's ethical. It's the ethical thing to do. So I encourage you in your process, and hopefully one day we'll hear that you succeeded marvelously and everything worked out.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the same time, I'm also trying to introduce atomic design structure, design pattern into the in our organization, along with atomic CSS structure. So those are the things I'm just working, and that's the goal in my in my to-do list for the next year.
That's awesome. Vision is everything. I had a whole slide about it, so but it's great to hear.
Thank you, Suvik.
Cool.
Thank you, Alexa. Guys, do you have any more questions or any topic you want to discuss? Okay, I think people must be really angry. It's time here.
It's been a brilliant conversation. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted. And if obviously feel free to anybody to connect with me on LinkedIn if you want to keep chatting about this. I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I'm really thankful for the invitation, Joe. The IDF does fantastic things. I've been a member for a while, so this is a great opportunity and a great topic to talk about.
Thank you, Alexa, for giving us the time to and sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you a lot. It was a brilliant conversation. Thank you.
Great. You're very welcome. Well, have a really nice evening, everybody, I guess. Bon appetit.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I hope you to see in the 17th of December. We will have Jason Vallejo talking about what happens when a UX has actually a seat on the table, and that sometimes not taking a decision is a decision. And once again, Alexa, thank you a lot for your time.
You're very welcome. Good luck with the rest of the Winter Talks. It's a great program.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Bye.
Bye.